Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. It's no secret that organizational culture can make or break the workplace experience. Moreover, it can also affect things such as creativity, productivity, engagement, motivation, and even talent acquisition and retention. It's easy to see how important the organization's culture can be. When we look at organizational cultures that embrace the ideas of empathy and appreciation, we see that such a culture has the potential to promote innovation and change, specifically positive change. It can boost morale. It can also create an inclusive and a safe environment for its employees. And of course, it is generally good for both individual and organizational well-being. So, where good company culture is one that comes with many benefits, a culture that specifically focuses on, or at least includes, the ideas of empathy and appreciation seems to have some added bonuses when it comes to the benefits that come with that kind of culture in an organization. While generally speaking, culture comes from the top down, meaning those at the very top have the power, whether or not it is a recognized power or an intended power, have the power to create the culture within the organization. It can be done through direct intervention. It can be done through demonstration, or it can also be done through absence, if you will. But generally speaking, we know that culture comes from the top down. What's important to remember, though, is that that's not the only thing in terms of where culture comes from and how it is sustained. It's important to remember that individuals at every level of the organization have the power to influence. Does that mean that one person can change the entire culture for the whole company? Maybe, maybe not. But the most important takeaway is that individuals are not without power. They definitely have the power to influence the culture of their organization. And certainly, every individual has the power to influence the environment around them, and therefore the culture around them, the organizational culture around them. Sometimes it may feel like the person is a culture of one, but even that has its own power. So the reason why I bring up that point, that organizational culture, although largely dependent on those at the top, is not limited to solely that influence, because I want you all to think about your own power, both as individuals and then collectively as an organization, regardless of where you are in terms of the organizational structure. Having said all that, it's important to remember that at the end of the day, in many ways, it all comes down to conduct, both in terms of the individual and in terms of the organization. What we're talking about here is the do's and the don'ts, the things that you do and the things that you don't do, the things that you should do or shouldn't do. It's the things that you say as much as the things that you don't say. It's the behaviors that you exhibit as much as the ones that you don't, the ones that you avoid. So it all comes down to conduct. Again, regardless of whether or not we're talking at the individual level or the organizational level. When it comes to empathy and appreciation in terms of the fabric of the organizational culture, there are some very definite things that can aid in the success of the endeavor. Research has shown us the importance of authenticity. I think that everyone listening or watching, if you're watching the podcast in a video format, it's pretty common sense to assume that efforts that are authentic are easily recognized as such, and efforts that are not authentic will become obvious for what they are sooner or later. So authenticity has been shown as an important factor when it comes to organizational culture, especially one that embraces and promotes empathy and appreciation as part of the culture. And again, these are critical components both at the organizational level and at the individual level. It's important that we walk the talk. The do as I say, not as I do mentality doesn't work at either level, the organization or the individual. So part of those critical components required for success, is the idea of actually walking that talk rather than proclaiming that others do as you say, not as you do. So that's an important component. Studies have shown that follow-through is a big deal. There have been many disappointed employees who are promised one thing or another by the organization and then never have any follow-through, never have any real results. So it comes down to nothing more than talk. And of course, it goes both ways. There are things that employees as individuals can promise but fail to deliver. So that is another important component of a successful development and way of sustaining a successful culture that embraces empathy and appreciation. Consistency and regularity are also key. Being sporadic in your efforts, whether we're talking on the level of an individual or on the organizational level, being sporadic is not very effective, and it can be disappointing for those on the receiving end. So being consistent, being regular in your efforts is very important. Just as important is being deliberate and on purpose. There's no point in wasting anybody's time with declarations or any kind of efforts if there's no purpose to them. So whatever actions you take as an individual or an organization takes on that organizational level, there has to be a purpose to it. If there's no purpose to it, it's not going to last very long, and it's not going to gain much of a following and have much of a positive effect. So again, that's another important component when it comes to creating and sustaining an organizational culture that embraces empathy and recognition for others. There are many schools of thought when it comes to organizational culture, and there are many research studies that show us the importance and the value, the benefit of the right organizational culture. Of course, we have the flip side of the coin. Many studies show us just how detrimental the wrong organizational culture can be. So we all know the importance of the right culture. And however you approach it individually may vary in some ways. But the bottom line is that when we look at a culture that embraces and promotes empathy and appreciation, there are certain things that are key, certain things that are critical in terms of attaining and sustaining such a culture successfully. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. There are many benefits associated with the right culture within an organization. It can absolutely make or break the individual's experience at the workplace. But the important takeaways is this, that when it comes to culture, especially culture that focuses and embraces empathy and appreciation, the responsibility belongs to everyone. So just as the culture for an organization generally flows from the top down, so too each individual has a certain amount of power to influence the culture of the organization and the environment around them. The other point is that there are certain components that are key when it comes to the successful endeavor in creating and sustaining the right culture. Remember the importance of authenticity, walking the talk, and follow through. Of course, being consistent and on purpose are equally as important. As the week unfolds, I invite you to consider the culture within your organization, whether you are in a leadership role and at the top, where culture generally typically originates and flows from, or whether you are anywhere else within the organization. You have a certain amount of power, some more than others, to influence the culture around you, and certainly to influence the environment around you, to influence your experience and the experience of others at the organization. So consider, what kind of culture are you working within, and how are you contributing to that culture? How are you affecting that culture? Remember that regardless of where you are within the organizational structure, you have some kind of power, some kind of influence. And of course, if we're talking at the organizational level, the responsibility is greatest at that level for creating and sustaining the right kind of culture. So I invite you to consider the culture where it is now and whether or not it embraces empathy and appreciation. And if not, how can you make changes that will do so and sustain the right kind of culture? For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I invite you to check out my YouTube channel where you can find the video version of the podcast. The link for that is in the description below, and that is Stress Free with Dr. G. In addition to the video version of the podcast, my YouTube channel also contains videos that focus on stress management, so I invite you to check that out. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.